I'm Adam Hart and I am Professor of Science Communication at the University of Gloucestershire. Quite a large part of what my work involves at the moment is trying to protect one of the most iconic, one of the most recognisable animals on the planet, and that's the rhino. In Africa, there are two species of rhino, white rhino and black rhino, and they are both under huge pressure at the moment and have been for a long time because of the horn on their face, because of the thing that makes them a rhinoceros. People want to cut those horns off and use them for all kinds of things, traditional medicine being one of the main things they're being used for. But to get those horns off, the rhino don't need to be killed, but they usually are, and it's often pretty brutal. And that onslaught, that poaching onslaught, has massively reduced numbers of rhino in these areas, and it continues to be a huge pressure. So one of the things that I'm interested in looking at is how we can do anti-poaching, trying to combat this in a more effective way. So using things like infrared, for example, thermal imaging, seems very high tech, but actually you can buy thermal imaging detectors that fit in your pocket now for a few £100s. Well, are they as effective as the sort of military grade equipment that people are often thinking about? Turns out, based on some research that we've done, that yes, in the field, they are just as effective. And that's great because it means that you can put this capability into people's pockets without spending too much money. So that's one of the things that I'm interested in. Looking at rhino as well, I'm looking at doing the management plan along with some other people for a national park in Zimbabwe where they have rhino. And a massive part of that is looking at how we can safeguard and secure those rhinos. So that involves all kinds of things, including looking at stuff like fence construction, which I was looking at this morning, which becomes a really interesting sort of extra amounts of information. You know, when you're a conservation scientist, you're interested and involved in all kinds of different things, and that for me is one of the things that makes this topic so exciting. A typical day in any scientist's life is quite a difficult thing to sum up, but perhaps today is as typical a day as any. I did a bit of work this morning with a Radio 4 documentary that I've been working with, and on looking at some conservation issues, looking at the influences of things like hunting, for example, on conservation. And then I spent most of the morning working on a management plan for a national park in Zimbabwe. So this is a project that me and several colleagues are involved with, looking at developing a new management plan for this area. And that's super exciting to get involved with. Because it's not just about conservation, it's actually about things like tourism, for example. I spent some of this morning working out the prices of various different types of vehicles and their maintenance schedules. It seems kind of a weird thing for a biologist to be doing, but actually it's a really important part of conservation. And I think for me, that's one of the most important and most interesting things about the job, is that you never quite know what you're going to be doing, and you never quite know what skills you're going to be honing or developing or sort of trying to make up on the fly as you go along. And for me, I love that endless variety and changes. But that's a typical day. A typical day is very diverse. I think one of the most exciting things about working in conservation science is the fact that you might well have the chance to make a real difference. We are in a biodiversity crisis. There's no doubt about that. And we can sit and talk about it, and we can sit and sort of scratch our heads about it, or we can try and get out there and do something about it. And I think that's one of the really exciting things about getting involved in conservation science, particularly the applied side of conservation science, is that there's a chance to get out there and do something about it, not just for yourself, but also if you're doing the research and you can get that research out in people's hands and say, look, this is a better way of doing things, let's do it this way. That gives you a real chance to change something. And I think in amongst all of the sort of doom and gloom of the modern world, and there is a lot of doom and gloom, and we are in this crisis, it's a really nice and exciting thing to be able to say, look, we can make a difference, and what we do can make things better. So for me, that's a real high point. To get into my current role, I've had a rather unusual sort of route into conservation sciences. I didn't study conservation science initially. I did some conservation as part of my undergraduate degree, but I was actually a zoologist who became an entomologist, who then became an ecologist, And as a consequence of working in lots of different areas, particularly in Southern Africa, got much, much more into conservation and conservation science. And that's largely where I've been in the last 10 years or so. So it's always easy with a career to sort of stand and say, okay, well, this is the stepping stones that I took. And it makes it look like you had a plan, but I didn't really have a plan. I followed my interests, and my original interests were in insects and living together and sociality and things like ants, bees and wasps. But I always had this burning kind of interest in big African wildlife. And yeah, I got lucky and I was able to start developing a field course in South Africa, and then realized that a lot of the ecology that I was getting involved with teaching was applicable to these systems. And pretty soon I found myself studying them and becoming a conservation scientist. But I've still got a real interest in all of the sort of small things too. And for me, that's super important, because one of the things you realize is that everything's interconnected. You know, these days in biology, it's really super important to have some real sort of lasers type skills in particular areas, but having an idea of how all of these things are interconnected is massively important. So I'm really pleased that I've had that broad foundation. The advice I will always give to any future biologists: keep that passion alive. If you have a passion and a love for science, a love for the natural world, do what you can in the face of lots of people telling you that lots of things are more interesting, or that you don't want to get interested in that. Ignore them, right? Keep that passion alive. Respark it at the right time when you're doing GCSE, when you're doing A levels, when you're making a decision about what sort of degree you want. If you've got that passion there, you can find it again, and you can find an incredibly rewarding career that has the power to take you all over the world. I think I've totted up something like 48 different countries as a consequence of being interested in biology. It's an amazing way to meet incredible people, to see incredible things, and to get involved in incredible, life-changing, world-changing sometimes science. So keep that passion alive. That's my advice to you.